Welcome to the Moorooka social space. It is a very hot and steamy day, so thank you for venturing out here when you'd rather be at the beach or down at the reservoir. My name's Amy McMahon. I'm the State MP for South Brisbane. We're just a little bit out of South Brisbane here, but general south side vibes down here. I'll also start by acknowledging the rightful owners of the land that we're gathered on today, the Yagara and Turrbal people, and pay our respects to elders past and present, and remember that sovereignty was never ceded and we meet on stolen land. And I think the struggle for housing justice is a central struggle when we're talking about First Nations communities and rebalancing the immense inequality that colonisation has caused over the last 2 centuries. And we're also lucky to have Gary Oliver here from the Black Greens, who we'll be hearing from a little bit later, a long-time advocate for First Nations communities and housing justice. But thank you so much to everyone for coming along today. Obviously, housing is one of the biggest issues that we have been facing over the last year. When people ask me what are some of the biggest issues that have been coming to me and my staff in the office, housing is far and away the biggest issue that people have been coming through the door for. We know we have a massive crisis on our hands in Queensland. We've got 50,000 people waiting for social housing that doesn't exist. We have people who are struggling to pay their rent, people struggling to pay their mortgage. We've got people who have just given up and decided that they have no other options but to live in their car or live in a tent without the support that should be there for people. And housing is such a crucial part of someone's well-being the rest of their lives. If you don't have a secure place to call home, how can you get a job or work on your mental health or reconnect with your families or even just, live a good life if you don't have a safe place to call home? And yet we have seen the systematic underfunding of housing over decades. We're seeing the sell-off of social housing, and we are in this situation where in treating housing as a commodity, we have this massive gap between those who have sort of capital invested in housing and those who do not, and a widening gap between those people who don't have housing. The options to get secure housing are becoming slimmer and slimmer. But what we wanted to do today is talk a little bit about the solutions. We have been talking a lot over the last few years about a lot of the issues that we're facing in the housing space, talking about the way in which housing is treated as a commodity, talking about challenges around poverty and racism, talking about the massive power imbalance that exists between landlords and tenants, talking about the connection that exists between the major political parties and the real estate lobby and big corporations that have an interest in maintaining this very unequal system. We'll talk a little bit about some of the diagnoses of the challenges, but what we really wanted to get into today is some of the solutions, and from there, some of the things that we as a community can be pushing for to solve this crisis, to put power back into the hands of everyday people, out of the hands of the real estate lobby and those big corporations and the property developers, and start to create a society where everyone, no matter of your life experience or your background, has a safe place to call home. In a wealthy state like Queensland, there is no reason why we would have this massive crisis on our hands. And a lot of people will point to the pandemic as being a sort of key driver of what we're facing at the moment, but the pandemic has really just shown us the cracks that already existed before the pandemic started. We had a bubbling housing crisis on our hands, and this has just really accentuated a lot of these issues. So just for a bit of a structure of the day, we're going to be hearing from a panel of speakers. We are very lucky today to be joined by Karyn Walsh from Micah Projects, Dr. Karen Murray from the University of Sydney, and Jonathan Sri, the counsellor for the Gabba ward. So we're going to hear from each of our speakers. We're going to have a bit of a break to have some lovely food put on by the social space, and then we'll come back for some sort of insights from local organisations that are doing work on the ground after that, and then we'll have Q&A before we wrap up. So really thankful to all of you to be here today and to take part in what is a sort of crucial discussion here in Queensland at the moment. I wanted to start with just a bit of an overview from what myself and the Greens have been doing over the last 12 months and the kinds of things that we have been pushing for, just to sort of set the scene. As I mentioned, we have been getting dozens of people coming through the door with housing issues, dealing with people in very acute situations of homelessness, and very few options in terms of where people can go when the housing stock just doesn't exist. One of the big issues underlying a lot of this is a planning system that is designed for property developers and the real estate lobby to make money at the expense of people actually getting a safe place to call home. Dr. Karyn Murray is going to go into this in a little bit more detail, but essentially our planning system at the moment is allowing, particularly in places like West End, Woolloongabba, this huge proliferation of new development. And a lot of people would think, well, we've got all these new apartments, why do we still have a housing crisis on our hands? And when you've still got apartments that are unaffordable for so many people, if you have more and more supply of unaffordable housing, it's not going to be solving the issues for people on the ground to access that housing. We've got all these new apartments, with a lot of them are vacant for reasons that Jonathan Sree is going to go into in a bit more detail. But essentially we have this system that allows property developers to make millions of dollars off the backs of our communities without any investment back into our neighbourhoods. We have no requirements for things like inclusion rezoning, very little money that developers have to pay back to council to invest in crucial public infrastructure. And so we've been arguing for a complete overhaul of the Planning Act to put people back at the heart of planning, to have a planning system that is driven by the community, where people have a genuine say. A lot of you would have had the experience of seeing big developments going up in your neighbourhood, and you might have written a submission or you contacted your local councillor, and these big developments have gone ahead anyway. The community basically has no say in what goes on in terms of development, when the community is crying out for things like proper investment in public housing, when they're crying out for accessible libraries and green space, and all we're getting is large, expensive developments that most people can't access. So this is kind of a key thing that the Greens have been pushing for, a complete overhaul of the existing Planning Act, which when it was written in the year that both of the major parties were taking thousands and thousands of dollars in donations from property developers. So that whole system has the fingerprints of these big corporations all over it. One of the other big things we have been fighting for is proper renters' rights. We have this massive imbalance in Queensland between landlords and tenants. At the moment, if you're a tenant, you can't just freely put a hook in the wall or put up shelving. You have no long-term security in terms of how long you can stay in your home. There is no caps on by how much landlords can raise the rent. And so many people that we have spoken to have had the experience where an increase in rent is basically an eviction notice, and landlords know that, and they're able to use a system where you can pretty easily turf people out of a home to raise the rent and make more money. And there's nothing in our system at the moment that stops them from doing that. So we've been fighting for some pretty substantial changes in the way that renting works in Queensland to actually give tenants some power and security in their homes. People really should be able to move into a home and be able to stay there as long as you want, as long as you're paying the rent and you're looking after the place. But that is your home. That is your home. And having that security is really crucial. We've been speaking to so many people who are saying, well, I'm going to be priced out of this neighbourhood and my kids won't be able to go to the local school. They'll be taken out of their community. They're going to have to move to a neighbourhood where they don't know anyone, communities being ripped apart because we have a system that's really set up for people to make money as opposed to being set up for people to have one of the most fundamental human rights, which is housing. The government are completely captured by the real estate lobby, and we saw that with the recent laws that went through Queensland Parliament that were very substantially watered down due to the pushback from the real estate lobby, who have a huge amount of influence and networks and resources and absolutely no shame in terms of what they're arguing for. The other big thing that's on the kind of long-term agenda for Brisbane is the 2032 Olympics. We know from looking at cities around the world that have hosted the Olympics, this has a huge impact on house prices. It has a huge impact on the surrounding neighbourhoods that host the Olympic Games. It's very likely that the main stadium will be the Gabba. We're not very far away from there. There's going to be a huge concentration of new development over the next 10 years as we lead into the Games, with lots of developers looking to cash in on the Olympics. Looking at Sydney, for example, house prices in the Olympic corridor rose by 23% above inflation. So in that little pocket, massive increases in house prices, rents increasing by anywhere between 15 and 40% in the years leading up to the Games. Lots of Sydney city councils reporting spikes in homelessness. A lot of the people who were in homeless shelters during the period of the Games had never been homeless before, and a massive displacement of people. And this happens nearly everywhere where Olympics are hosted. There's some pretty shocking research to show that since the 80s, the Olympic Games have displaced 2 million people globally. In Atlanta in 1996, there was 30,000 people who were displaced from their homes because of gentrification, and about 9,000 people who were just rounded up by the cops. We also see this massive process of city cleansing that goes on. So we're sort of starting the conversation to let people know that the Olympics, while with incredible benefits, will also have a whole lot of social impacts that aren't being talked about, and making sure the community aware. And so we can start organising to make sure that we have the systems in place to make sure existing communities can stay put, have the housing they need, can get access to the education and services that they need. So I might talk about this a bit more in the Q&A, but we do have this vision statement that we're putting together to get some feedback from all of you about what kind of city do we want leading up to the Olympics. Could this be an opportunity to say by 2032 in Queensland, we have zero homelessness, and making this part of the agenda and part of the funding that's coming through for the Olympics. So that is a little overview from me and some of the stuff that we've been pushing for over the last 12 months. I'd now like to hand over to Karyn Walsh, who runs Micah projects, which many of you would have heard, based in West End, but do amazing work supporting people right across the city who are doing it tough. So welcome, Karyn.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting, elders past, present and future, and also the disproportionate number of Indigenous people that are homeless. At the moment, by our stats, that's up to about 30% in Brisbane of all people presenting homelessness are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. Many of the things that Amy's already said, we know are the drivers of homelessness, and we see over 3,000 people in different streams, including women and children leaving violent relationships, and we want to stop those women having to go back to those relationships or becoming homeless. We also see people coming with many children. I suppose COVID, while it has raised the sort of profile, it is a bit different since COVID. We haven't seen as many people present with ending of leases because of the sale of their properties, and that they probably won't go back to, they'll probably go to home ownership, like they won't be renting. So some of the strategies that have been developed, like head leasing, is often referred to getting money, because the basic reason people are homeless is that their income doesn't match the rent. Like, we hear a lot of things about the personal characteristics of people who are homeless, but the personal characteristics are as varied as our whole population. There are particular issues for people who are most vulnerable, and that's certainly the people on the lowest income, so New Start. So we really can't address homelessness if we don't address New Start. And people with mental illness being discharged from hospitals, people being discharged from prisons. So there's a whole lot of system drivers that end up with people in particular circumstances being overrepresented. But it could also just be a friend of ours who has lost their job and, hasn't got the income. And we saw that quite a bit over COVID with the casual work and not being able to show and demonstrate when they apply for housing that they have an income to pay the rent. So it's a moving, changing sort of thing. We were disappointed with the rent reforms not going far enough, but that, I think people are continuing to advocate for that. But when we talk about the solutions, we talk about, first of all, we have to believe homelessness is solvable. When I listen to many politicians, academics, people, that it's called a wicked problem. And I think for too long we've seen it as a wicked problem that can't be solved. And what that does is perpetuate the growth of homelessness, because it just means we accept it's a reality. And we really have to accept that doesn't have to be a reality. If the distribution of resources was such that we didn't have such a lag in social housing, then we'd have a completely different story. If everybody stopped blaming each other, whether that's Commonwealth, state, local, business, community, and started to say, well, we believe this is something we want to join forces on and we want to solve, there are things that could happen that could make a difference. And I'm not an expert on all of those, but planning is certainly one of them. And what's happening with the stock that we exist? Why is the housing stock decreasing and not increasing at the rate we want it to? Then we would say that there are three key areas that we have to do concurrently because of the situation. One is to prevent people becoming homeless, so really have good laws that protect renters. We need to have financial assistance available so that during an adverse situation or a short-term crisis, we can help people pay their rent for a couple of weeks or whatever they need to relocate for DV, for example. We can pay to help relocation costs, plan when people can move to their next house, or try and play a role in keeping women safe at home so they don't have to move. But then that also requires some intervention about their income, because two incomes paying a rent is not the same as one income paying a rent. So the complexity of it is something that we can't just juggle. One thing's going to solve it. Certainly, making sure people are aware of their rights as tenants, aware of their rights under the Human Rights Act, is something we try and do as much as we can. But it's still a very imbalanced system, and will be for years to come, I think, unless some magic wand is waved, but we can't stop advocating for it. We also then have strategies that say we've got to reduce homelessness for the people that are homeless. So that really means that we know by name who is on the street. And if you started with rough sleepings, we have 3 know by name lists, we call them. One of those on the street that we know, and we track when those people become homeless, how long it takes for them to get housing. And of course, many of them don't get it in a timely manner. So then that leads to the second list of how many people are in boarding houses who don't want to be there. And then families, like at the moment, we'd have 140 families in Brisbane who are homeless. They're living in motels. There are some interventions. Motels are putting their rates up every day. Like this week, we had 3 more that have put them up $100 a week. And basically it's because they're not posh hotels, they're just really basic hotels. And, you know, but the competition for those rooms are people renovating, people coming up who are waiting for their contract to be signed, people, you know, sort of looking around for where their next house will be if they've sold. So you've got this great competition now for really basic accommodation and emergency accommodation. But, you know, we would put probably over 700 people in emergency accommodation through brokerage funds that we get from government every year. We don't think it's a strategy, you know, it's a strategy we'd love not to have to use, but we are getting better at tracking where people are, making sure that we know when people become homeless again and why. Part of that often is they don't have the support they need when they are housed, because we are talking about a range of people, and only about 30% of people that we see need those intense interventions of embedding healthcare and support in their housing. But housing is such a great foundation to actually put those services in the housing. It means we could go to scale in it because it's not as expensive the more people you're supporting, but it certainly means that you can end homelessness. And that's one of our key strategies, is that we have a housing crisis that extends right from home ownership to people living on the streets. But the bit that we're really trying to focus on is the most vulnerable. What is the kind of housing you need for the most vulnerable citizens of Australia? And we call that supportive housing. And that's where you plan the housing by design. You can bring in, you know, make them environmentally sound housing, go to scale. So they might be bigger complexes than we've had in the past. Embed nursing care and social support in those buildings, or if it's a scattered site model in a neighbourhood, so that people can sustain their tenancy in a way that they also have a quality of life, that they're just not thrown in the deep end, really. Like, just, it's sort of like you just get matched to a house. So, and then there are two other things that it has to have collaborative effort. NGOs can't do it on their own, even with government funding. Governments need to get over each other and work together, and local councils need to be very much engaged in the planning discussions. And finally, we just need to realign what we do so that we're not managing people in homeless so they're homeless for 15 years. We actually have an end result where they're housed, supported, and can be connected to their community and culture. So thanks.
Thanks so much, Karyn. I really agree with the sentiment of governments just getting over each other and that buck passing that goes on. I'd like to now welcome up Dr. Cameron Murray from the University of Sydney, who has been doing some really amazing research over the last few years. Some of you may have read his book, Game of Mates, but welcome to the microphone.
We'll get there. Thanks, everyone. Sorry, I've got my notes on my phone. I'm not texting while I'm here. Thanks for having me, everyone. I'll probably change tune a little bit here. I'm an economist, so you'll excuse me. I'm going to go on a bit of an economic rant, but I guess where I'd start with housing is there's a bit of a challenge in housing of knowing what the problem is. You know, I've put out surveys on social media and people have lots of different concerns. Is it the price? Is it the rent? Is it security? Is it that the home ownership rate's falling? We all have sort of different concerns, and I think you need to sort of understand each one to really get a handle of what the solutions might be. So, for example, is our concern that the asset price of a house, I call it the asset price because it is an asset and is priced in asset markets, is it too high? Well, we've got the asset market we want, okay? We want high house prices. I know this because we use monetary policy to stabilize the economy. And when I open an economic textbook, do you know what it tells me? Low interest rates reduce mortgage costs for homeowners and increase the value of their houses, incentivizing them to spend more money in the economy. It's literally written there. that the effect of lower interest rates is higher house prices. That's why we do it. That's why we're having a synchronized global boom right now. If you think prices have gone up a lot in Brisbane, try New Zealand, try Phoenix, Arizona, try Frankfurt. Okay, it's a synchronized global boom. So if we cared about asset prices, our focus should perhaps be where that comes into it. I actually often say we could do a more honest version of macroeconomic policy by just putting money in the bank accounts of homeowners. What if our problem was high rents? Well, high rents don't come out of nowhere. High rents come out of high incomes. A lot of what we're seeing right now is rental growth because high income people are relocating. And in fact, average incomes are growing very quickly. The average bank account at the Commonwealth Bank has $11,000 more in it now than it had before COVID. Okay? Rents in inner city Sydney and Melbourne have gone down. They're not even where they were 10 years ago because those high income people are relocating. So what we're sort of seeing in Australia, and we're seeing it internationally as well, is this gentrification on a mass scale of high income households relocating to traditionally lower income areas and displacing those existing people. So that if we're thinking about what to do, we should at least understand that process. Maybe our concern is the security of rental. Maybe we're concerned that landlords have too much power to kick tenants out and raise the rents. Well, that doesn't have to be the case. We can choose any rental regulation we like. And in fact, in economics, if we just take our mind away from housing for a minute, we actually have price cap regulation in lots of other fields, in railway lines, in power generation, in telecoms, where you can't just put the price up because you're a monopoly service provider. You can only put your price up if you've spent more on capital works. It's totally normal price cap regulation. But when we take it to housing and say, yeah, you can get the market rent, but you can't just jack up the price once someone's there, we all lose our head and think we're doing something radical. Maybe our concern's the home ownership rate. But actually, we've seen record first home buying in the last 12 months, 180,000 first home buyers. And usually it's between 80 and 100,000. So in fact, I've predicted that this August 2020 census that we all completed, we'll see the first rise in home ownership across Australia since 2006. So then the question is, well, that's kind of weird. I thought housing was getting less affordable, yet more people are buying their first homes than ever. Well, one of the issues there is that the distribution of home ownership is rapidly skewing older. So if you're older than 65, it's over 90% of people own a home. But if you're younger than 40, I think it's dropped from 65 to 34% in the last 30 years. So that's where the real tension is. It's the inequality of ownership. It's the inequality of access to rents that are driving these issues. So why are we continually sold this idea that rezoning is the solution to all these different housing concerns, high rents, high prices, declining home ownership? Well, I mean, the short answer is it's in the interest of people who own land to argue that there's the solution and get rezoned. But I found it interesting because there's a federal housing inquiry going on right now into housing supply and affordability. And I asked the chair of this inquiry, Jason Falinsky, who's a New South Wales MP, why don't you bring the housing developers in where they're obliged to be honest and can't perjure themselves at your hearing, and ask them if they think rezoning will reduce prices. So last week he did. He asked them the question, do you think we could get 20% price reductions through mass rezoning in Australia? And they all said no, completely implausible, not going to happen. Yeah, rezoning agricultural land for sprawl, rezoning industrial land for high rise, just massively increasing the stock of potential sites where you can build housing. All the biggest developers in Australia say that's not going to reduce prices, which I found quite interesting, right? Because, when they talk to a journalist and there's no obligation to be honest, they'll say the opposite thing. And when they talk under oath at the hearing, they'll say, actually, it's not going to work. And the same thing happened in the UK. I think in 2012, they had a similar inquiry and they dragged the housing developers in and they all said, oh yeah, no, it'd be good, but yeah, probably won't reduce prices. What they mean is it'll be good for us, but it won't reduce prices. And I think one of the tricks with this rezoning is that we we get tricked into thinking that density and supply are the same thing when they're not. Okay, the density is the number of dwellings per unit of land. The supply is the number of dwellings per period of time across all potential locations. Yeah? And it's not the same thing, because a property developer is not, they're not stupid, right? They know that the market can absorb each year a particular rate of new housing in their area. And if they try and sell faster, they'll have to reduce prices. So there's a maximum rate they're willing to supply, and there's a sequence that optimizes their present value of that revenue. And it doesn't matter whether you can build 100 units on a site or 200 or 500, that optimal sequence is the same. So it might be 4 dwellings a month or 2 dwellings a month. And if the market falls, it might be 0. I studied the land banks of Australia's top 12 landowners, and in I studied 249 of their currently for sale land subdivisions. And in the previous year, 5 of them didn't sell even 1 site, because they didn't want to reduce price to increase the rate of sales. So I think we need to, stand up and point out this fact to them. And, we shouldn't let developers dictate the terms here. If they come and say, look, you need to rezone us, we need to be approved for this high density, otherwise there'll be no more houses, just say to them, so you're telling me you're going to flood the market if we approve this high density thing and crash prices? Is that what you're telling me? I might just have a word to your investors about that, because that seems like a very financially reckless thing to do. Okay, so you're either financially reckless or you're lying to me. Can't be both, right? So I think that's important to keep in mind. So we've been baffled by that trick. Another trick that we've been sold is that build to rent is going to provide secure rental for everyone, and it's going to reduce rental prices. Now, that's kind of interesting, because we have a great experiment in Queensland at the Gold Coast. The former Commonwealth Games Athletes Village is now called Smith Collective. It's the first and largest build-to-rent project in Australia. 1,251 dwellings that were finished in 2017. The manager there told me in January this year that they still have 3 buildings to release to the rental market of the Gold Coast, because they're on a staged release strategy over 4 years so as not to flood the rental market. So they kept hundreds and hundreds of fully complete brand new dwellings vacant for years on the Gold Coast with the tightest rental market in history, because that was what was optimal for them to do. Now you can imagine the case when you're actually selling $1 million apartments. It's going to be optimal for you to drip feed that out. So I find it quite amazing. If you also look at the historical rental ads from that development, they put the price up just as quickly and just as much as anybody else. So don't think that's a solution either. And I often say, I have no idea why we got convinced that creating a bigger, wealthier, more sophisticated class of landlords was somehow going to be better for tenants. So what's the solution? Well, let me scroll down to my solution section here. I think high asset prices are, well, the easy thing to do is put interest rates up or tax the assets, right? It's not that difficult. It's difficult politically because we're in a world where everybody runs, interest rate policy somewhat in sync. High rents, we can introduce price cap regulation in rents. It's not that difficult, we can do it. Insecure rents, again, we can solve that. Home ownership for young people is quite difficult, but we can actually sort of solve them all. And we know we can, because there's a country called Singapore, and it's a real country. And it has 90% home ownership, and 84% of the dwellings were built by the public housing provider. And it sells them at construction cost price to any citizen aged 30 with a discounted mortgage. And if we copied that, it costs them about $2 billion a year from their budget to build 30,000 new dwellings in Singapore a year. These are big, fancy buildings. It would be way cheaper here. $2 billion a year to supply 30,000 new dwellings into their system, into their public ownership system, because you can actually buy that and sell it to the private market after 5 years. Okay, so it's a sort of a gift to every citizen of a share of the land of the community, which I really like the idea of. And so we could copy that here, $2 billion a year, 30,000 dwellings. We spent hundreds of billions of dollars on the COVID stimulus. We gave away $32 billion to as yet unknown businesses for the cash flow boost. Yeah. $2 billion is nothing. And in fact, I would argue we should spend twice that. And instead of calling it a cost, call it an investment. That's how the politicians do it. Things they don't like, oh, that's a cost. That's an expense. Things they do like, oh, that's an investment. On this side, spending more is good. On this side, spending more is bad. So you want to take housing and put it on that side, call it an investment, spend $5 billion a year. Give every citizen who doesn't own a home the right to buy one at a discounted price. It's doable because Singapore's done it for half a century and we know their results. And it solves all of those 4 problems of insecure housing, home ownership, high rents that I've talked about. So thank you. We have Q&A.
Thank you so much for that, Cameron. We will have time for question and answers afterwards. I'm going to share a few comments and then we'll have a break and then we'll come back for more discussion and Q&A. Thank you for having me along. I'm Jonathan Sree. I'm a city councillor with Brisbane City Council. Also shout out to Steve Griffiths, who's the Moorooka councillor. Thank you for coming along, Steve. It's good to see you here. Thanks to Amy for organising and to Karyn and Cameron. Also wanted to acknowledge the rightful owners of this place, the Yagara and Turrbal peoples, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. And again, kind of recognise the voices that are absent or underrepresented in this conversation. The last housing forum we had a full panel of Aboriginal First Nation speakers, and it was really good to hear people drawing the connections between colonisation, evictions, displacement, etc. And I do think we need to kind of keep what Karyn pointed out at the forefront of our minds, that 30% of people currently experiencing homelessness in Brisbane identify as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. And I think that really says a lot. So kind of picking up on some of the themes we've already heard here, I just wanted to bring it back a moment to the kind of the lived experience. And I was reflecting on my own story. The first time I moved into a share house in West End, I was really excited. I got to know all the neighbours. I went and said hi to the local businesses on the street. I started planting a veggie garden. I spent all my spare change on pot plants and stuff. And then 10 months later, the landlord evicted us and turned our house into a restaurant. And that was a bit sad, very sad at the time. Moved into another share house and started planting a garden. I planted a banana sucker in the front yard and was buying some rosemary and planting that all up. Got to know the neighbours, elderly Greek neighbours, and the rat bags down the street with the house parties and all that sort of stuff. Felt like I was part of a community. 12 months later, the landlord put the rent up and I couldn't afford the high rent, so I had to move again. And the third share house I moved to, I didn't bother planting a garden and I didn't bother getting to know the neighbours. And I think that's a really common experience for a lot of younger people, is when you don't have tenancy security, when you're worried that the rent might go up or that your lease might not be renewed, you don't feel that strong incentive to invest in your local community. And you don't maybe want to spend as much time getting to know your neighbours or to plant a local garden or all that sort of stuff. Some of us do, despite that. But it's a big problem, particularly for someone like me as a city councillor, where I'm trying to get lots and lots of residents interested in local issues. And people are like, oh, Jono, why would I campaign for a new bus route in this area? I don't think I'm going to be able to afford to live here in 5 years' time. So that, I think, is sort of a flow-on consequence of the way housing is treated as a commodity in our system, is that it causes a breakdown of community, a breakdown of local engagement, and in the process, a breakdown of democracy. And the other threat that housing presents to democracy is that people are so stressed and busy just trying to pay the rent or trying to pay the mortgage that they have less time and energy to engage with broader discussions about what kind of world we want to live in. They don't, who has the time to come along to policy forums and debates and all that sort of stuff? You're the rare exceptions, interestingly enough. But also people are so worried about economic precarity. They're so worried that they might lose their job and become homeless that they are often too scared to stand up for their rights in other contexts, such as the workplace. So I talk to a lot of people, even say middle-class people in comfortable jobs and comfortable positions, who they know their business is doing something unethical, or they know their boss is exploiting workers or ruining the environment or whatever, but they don't want to make an ethical choice to refuse to work there or to stand up against that boss or to stand up for their colleagues' work rights. because they're worried that they might lose their job and not be able to pay their mortgage or not be able to pay the rent. So a precarious and unaffordable housing system is actually a major barrier to social change on a whole range of other issues as well. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. And that for me is why housing in particular is such an important issue to be talking about. I'm picking up from sort of some of those ideas Karyn mentioned. One of the ones that's really hit home for me lately is that point about how rezoning to increase the supply of new housing in the private sector does not improve affordability. And as Karyn said, that happens for a few reasons. One, it's because developers just won't sell stuff. They'll build it, or they'll subdivide the blocks of land and they'll have it there, but they'll just leave it empty. And we see that a lot in the inner city. We're waiting with interest to see what the new census data shows in terms of how many apartments and homes and blocks of land are being left vacant. But we need to really strongly challenge that narrative that just building more private apartments or building more houses is going to improve affordability, particularly in this area. And I think Claire might talk about this later. We've got the Moorooka neighbourhood plan coming through, and the development industry is saying we need to rezone for higher density to create more housing, and that'll improve affordability. Actually, what that will do, rezoning for higher density development, will push up the land values. And as land values go up, the house prices will go up. And if the house prices go up on all the blocks of land that are yet to be developed, the prices of the apartments will also go up, because suddenly a 3-bedroom house that used to be worth $400,000 is now worth $1 million because you could demolish it and put in townhouses. So if that house goes up in value, down the road, there's already some townhouses that have been built. Because this house is now $1 million, those townhouses will go up in value as well. And so the rezoning of blocks of land can actually put upward pressure, not just on the blocks of land that might be able to be redeveloped, but on house prices throughout the whole neighborhood. Does that kind of make sense? So one of the solutions we've been talking about in the Greens for a while now is the idea of a vacancy levy or a vacancy tax. And this is something that could be introduced at the local council level or at the state government level. At the local council level, I've given this a lot of thought because, you know, stuck on Brisbane City Council arguing with the Liberal Party and wondering how we could fix this thing. Brisbane City Council already has a rates discount for owner-occupiers. Maybe some of you own your own home, you're getting that rates discount if you own your own home. Everyone else who owns property, so all those landlord investors, they pay slightly higher rates. It would be very easy to introduce another class of rates discount where landlords who rent their homes out and can prove that they're keeping their tenants long-term, they also get a rates discount. So you have one rates discount for owner-occupiers, and you have another rates discount for any landlord who can say to the council, here, I've got tenants in, they've got a lease of at least 2 years, and the council will say, okay, we'll discount your rates. That creates an incentive for landlords to say, okay, I'm going to get tenants in. Anyone who's not getting that landlord discount or the owner-occupier discount pays rates through the nose, jack them right up. And it sounds like kind of politically dangerous because everyone's like, oh, you can't increase rates. But remember, we're only proposing to increase rates for the people who have their properties empty long-term. So no one else gets affected, but all those investors who are just leaving properties empty instead of renting them out cheaply, they pay through the nose. And the result of that would be some of those investors would sell their properties. They'd be like, screw it, I'm not paying these rates anymore. And so someone else will get it. Someone else will be able to buy that home. Some of those investors will say, okay, screw it, I'll get a tenant in then. They get a tenant in, great. Someone else has been able to find a rental property. Or they just keep paying that high rates. They leave their property empty, but at least that's more money coming into council and the public purse that we can then spend on public housing and social support services. So that's something that Brisbane City Council could do quite easily. It's also something that the state government or federal government could do. And other countries and other jurisdictions are already experimenting with it. That's only one piece of the puzzle, but I think it's an important one. And it's a very easy one for governments to do without even having to have the money to build lots of new public housing. But as Amy said, we should be doing that too. We should be creating new public housing. We should be creating well-designed public housing that's close to public transport and social support services and job opportunities, not just building stuff right out in the outer burbs where people still have to drive for 2 hours and maybe they're spending less on housing, but they're spending more on petrol. So it doesn't really actually work out much cheaper in the long run. So for me, really, the fundamental problem that we're grappling with is the treatment of housing as a commodity. It's the fact that we live in a world where housing should be a basic human right, but it's instead treated as a way to make money. That's really the fundamental problem. And we have this narrative in society that private property owners can do whatever they want with their property, and it's their right to do whatever they want and charge higher rent or leave it empty if they want to or whatever. Karyn was right to point out that for other services that we kind of consider essential or important, it's quite common to place caps. And for example, to say, hey, landlord, we're not going to allow you to put the rent up anymore. This is the limit. You cannot charge any more rent than that. Why can't we do that for housing? Rent caps are common in a lot of jurisdictions. One of the common arguments against rent caps, against saying to landlords, we're going to stop you putting your rent up, is that, if you introduce rent caps of some kind, that will discourage people from being investors. Good. We don't want them to be investors. We want them to sell those properties and let owner occupiers buy them. The argument is, but if it's so unprofitable to be an investor, then people won't build new private housing. If we make it too hard to be a property investor, people won't build more apartments, and then there won't be many properties. So if you introduce caps on rent, then that will reduce the supply of private rental accommodation. But actually what it will do is put downward pressure on land values, because if it becomes less profitable to be a developer and it becomes less profitable to be an investor, who's left to buy those blocks of land or who's left to buy those homes? It's people who want to be owner occupiers. So if we make it less attractive and profitable to be an investor, that doesn't actually reduce the supply of housing. It puts downward pressure on land values, which means that ordinary people can buy their first home, or it makes it easier and more affordable for the government to buy that land and deliver public housing. So again, it's kind of a win-win. So that's kind of where my head's at. But fundamentally, the problem is a broken system that rewards property investment and encourages people. We haven't even talked about negative gearing and capital gains tax discounts and all that sort of stuff. We can go into that in more detail later. But what I did want to flag is that after years of advocacy and moving reforms in Parliament and all writing petitions and submissions and all that sort of stuff, we've realized that the property industry has too much of a grip on political decision making. And so now what we're starting to do in Brisbane is organise collectively to apply bottom-up pressure on the system. And what that looks like on one level is that when a landlord is about to kick someone out into homelessness, when a landlord who's made millions of dollars extracting rent from tenants for years and years suddenly says, you know what, I'm doubling your rent. If you don't like it, you can move out. Or a landlord says, you complained too much because we weren't repairing your leaky shower, you're out. Our response to that is going to be to say, no, we're not going to allow this eviction. We're going to organise collectively and resist that eviction. And this form of eviction defence is kind of new to Brisbane, but a lot of other jurisdictions around the world, there's a lot of tenants organising to say, no, housing is a human right, and it is ethically irresponsible of you to kick someone out into homelessness. And so I'll talk a little bit more later on about that anti-eviction defenders idea. But I think right now we've had a lot of talking at you, and I'm conscious it's kind of been a while chilling in this room. So what I'd like to suggest is that we can take a sort of 15-minute break, head out into the garden, have a cuppa, have a snack, and think about what questions you want to ask. And then when we come back in here, we'll hear from a few other speakers briefly, and then we'll have an open Q&A with myself and Amy and Cameron and Karyn. Can we please thank our other speakers? And we'll see you back in here in 15 minutes.